Welcome to Introduction to Digital Humanities. This is Module 1, 1.3, which is exploring digital humanities in India. This also happens to be the name of a book that actually was edited by Nidhi Kalra, who's also at Flame University, and myself. And the work was begun in 2016. There was a very famous essay called Mapping Digital Humanities in India by P.P. Sneha, and she was at the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. And essentially it had asked the question of where is this to be found? Is it in academia? Is it in the country? And it prompted, I think, many of us to also reflect upon which universities are offering these courses. And at that time, very few actually were. So we were digging into not just the question of the academic interest in digital humanities, but really how digital technologies like mapping, databases, online archives, and more have changed the way in which people are doing work in the humanities. And this was not, of course, confined to the university. It included everything from history, literature, art, design, and cultural studies. In sort of keeping with what we saw, the book was divided into 4 broad sections, and each dealt with a different angle of this digital transformation. The first section is about digital histories, and one of our contributors, Dhanashree Thorat, looked at how India's colonial history still shapes the way the digital infrastructure of India has worked. Of course, P.P. Sneha had an article, and she was reflecting on the murky territory of defining digital humanities. So this, I think, question persists still today. She highlighted real examples like, of course, Buchitra is a very successful project, and even Project Madurai, which we will talk about again. But really the section was looking at how historians were using the public platforms of the digital and mapping tools to make their research more accessible and interactive. The book then sort of moved to another section which focused on pedagogy and institutions. And this was really the question of how digital humanities is being used in classrooms, as well as museums. Joyati Roy, who at that time was with the National Museum, talked about how Indian museums are digitizing their collections to reach broader audiences. And Sneha Raghavan, who works at the Asia Art Archive, discussed how online art databases were giving space to diverse voices in art writing. In classrooms, scholars like Nirmala Menon and Shanmuga Priya were looking at how sort of digital humanities was spreading across the curriculum in India. And Padmini Ray Murray, who had written about DH in terms of its Indian adaptations, took on ideas like Jugaad and other sort of categories of innovation. So she was discussing things like the creation of a video game and sort of reimagining what classical Sanskrit literature might look like for a digital age. The third part of the book looked at tools, and digital tools have been, of course, very critical to the way in which the field has expanded. And one of the ways that, it's been very impactful has been in the amplification of marginalized voices. So an interview with C.S. Lakshmi was very compelling in talking about the ethics of digital archiving, particularly when dealing with sensitive or private histories that were perhaps easier to contain in the analog and became a bit more explosive in the digital. A discussion similarly about digital archives for India's LGBTQ plus communities had similar concerns. And Surijit Sarkar talked about how fieldwork is also sort of evolving thanks to digital technology. These were sort of perhaps more familiar questions in terms of academic parlance, but because we are in India and so much had changed in the past decade given digital, we also wanted to talk about digital practices in culture industries. So the last part of the book talked about how Indian video games were adapting mythology and culture in new ways, and another chapter on digital media talked about radio and the rise of podcasts. The Hindustan Times was the first news outlet to have a digital first approach to journalism, and there was a chapter on that. So in many ways, we were not copy-pasting what Western models of digital humanities look like, but instead asking how have people built digital humanities practices that actually make sense for India. This meant taking into account India's multiple languages, oral traditions, cultural diversity, and of course, digital divides. It also means being very thoughtful about ethics, accessibility, and inclusion, especially when working with voices and stories that haven't traditionally been given spaces in academic or public discourse. In one of the first ever compilations on the state of digital humanities in India, or DH, which is exploring digital humanities in India, we explored a grand challenge in Indian academia. While there was a profusion of digital archiving, tools, and experiments with digital forms, the advent of DH as academic practice was slow to enter the Indian university and curriculum. To view DH as beyond digitization projects and as a more thorough aspect of public historical work allows for a focus beyond the university. In this review of DH work from India, I will preface my survey of the range of projects that have emerged from this region by stating that they have often surfaced from a public need and represent languages excluded in the erstwhile higher education landscape that linguistically prioritizes English. While DH is viewed as a recent addition to the humanities and now as an established area of inquiry in North American academia, what is significantly different in the Indian story is the absence of university funding and public grants for such works, with, of course, some notable exceptions. Now, if you look back at the history of higher education in India, what you see is since Indian independence in 1947, the growth of universities has significantly crossed 1,000 institutions. But this range of universities has been very uneven in terms of infrastructures for research in the humanities. Now, any account of these infrastructures would need to account for the diversity of all kinds of institutions and students across this ecosystem. But in emphasizing the point on unevenness, what is most striking is the reality of structural exclusion, not just because of scarcity of resources, but because of design limitations in the way higher education has functioned in the country. It took the National Education Policy of 2020 to even make higher education available for instruction in any Indian language other than English. Now again, if we consider that almost all higher education is conducted in English and speaking is certainly a means to realizing aspiration, it should never have justified the exclusion of all other languages. So the multilingual turn is the inflection point for digital humanities in India. One of the most significant interventions in this regard has been the Bhasha Research Organization. India's indigenous people, or Adivasis, account for over 8% of the country's population, or about 1/5 of indigenous peoples in the world. Often dependent on the lands that they occupy for a livelihood, but frequently rendered landless, they are unsurprisingly the most multilingual community in India. Studies have shown that out of the total tribal population in India, only 4% actually still speaks tribal languages, and that possibly as many as half of India's tribal population have already lost their language. Although the Indian Constitution offers protection for minority languages, few Adivasi languages have scripts and therefore are hardly used in educational spaces. In this context, Ganesh Devi, founder of the Bhasha Research and Publication Center and author also of many books, sought to remedy what he called the mismatch between knowledge and existence. Just as deforestation was ruining Adivasi lands, Devi noted the loss of life worlds as Adivasi languages too were rapidly being lost. To restore linguistic heritage, Devi's efforts were an early attempt at giving these languages script by printing the magazine Dhol, initiated for 11 dialects and intended to be read out aloud. It was his effort to include these languages in larger literary history that incorporated oral traditions by adding script for preservation. In his words, Bhasha's goals are to discover, publish, and promote linguistic, literary, and artistic heritage of tribal communities, to collaborate with existing national academies and research institutes of arts and literature, to encourage further research and publication at the national level, to establish an academy of formal instruction for the promotion of tribal languages with a view to conserving the tribal imagination. Now, having built this effort from the ground up, a vast archive of these publications has been amassed, and it now sits in a digital archive. In his edited anthology of tribal literature, Painted Words, Devi writes, a vast number of Indian languages have yet remained only spoken, and the result that literary compositions are not considered literature. They're a feast for the folklorist, anthropologist, or linguist, but to a literary critic, they generally mean nothing. In this regard, the valiant efforts of Devi get immortalized in the accompanying websites that feature a combination of strategies to combat this language loss. The collections are now housed online and offline at the Vach Museum, opened to the public in 2004. And they have compended language samples, prose, poetry, and song for over 12 different languages. There are over 120 books available for free digital download at the Bhasha Archives, and its geographical spread keeps growing.